Interruptions as training, notifications, governance, and the long horizon of judgment. What kind of person is being formed by the pattern of your day, by the moments you choose, and by the moments that choose you? That question is not designed to accuse, and it is not an invitation to nostalgia for a quieter era. It is a horizon question. When we look at a week, a year, a decade, what accumulates from small interruptions that feel too minor to matter? Not every interruption is harmful. Some are necessary, some carry care, some prevent mistakes. Yet the steady background of pings, banners, vibrations, and updates has become a kind of weather, present even when we do not look up. We are gathered around a modest object, the notification. It arrives as a small sign, often carrying a hint of urgency, and it asks for a fraction of a mind. But fractions add. Over time, they shape the mind that grants them. The stakes are ordinary, and because they are ordinary, they are easy to dismiss. Judgment is not only exercised in dramatic decisions, it is practiced in everyday attention. What we notice, what we ignore, what we return to after being pulled away. Identity is not only declared, it is rehearsed. If our days are repeatedly interrupted, then our selves are repeatedly reassembled. The question is not whether we are interrupted, the question is what those interruptions train, what they reward, and what they quietly displace. So we will look at notifications not as mere features and not as villains, but as a form of governance, a set of constraints and incentives that shape behavior at scale, often without explicit consent and often without clear visibility. We will do this calmly, with disciplined humility, because certainty is not available here, but clarity can still be practiced. When interruptions scale through notification systems, they become a form of governance that trains attention and thereby reshapes identity and judgment over time. This reflection will claim three things. First, that repeated interruption is not just a momentary inconvenience, but a training signal. Second, that the incentives and constraints behind that signal matter more than any single message. And third, that long-time horizons reveal second-order effects that short-term convenience can conceal. This reflection will not claim that notifications are universally harmful, that any one group is uniquely at fault, or that there is a single correct way to live. It will not offer a program or a cure. It will instead name dynamics, failure modes, and trade-offs, and it will leave space where certainty does not belong. To speak precisely, we need a few terms in plain language, not as jargon, but as handles. First term, attention. Attention is the part of the mind that selects. It decides what becomes foreground and what stays background. It is also orientation. Attention is the gate through which experience becomes meaningful. When attention is repeatedly redirected, the world is not only perceived differently, the self that perceives is organized differently. Second term, interruption. An interruption is an externally initiated demand for a context switch. It may be welcomed or unwelcome, urgent or trivial, meaningful or spam. What makes it an interruption is not its content, but its timing and control. It arrives on someone else's schedule. Even when we have agreed to receive it, it still functions as a claim on the present moment. Third term, notification. A notification is a standardized interruption delivered through a system. It compresses complex realities, messages, updates, reminders, alerts, into a small token of salience. It is designed to be noticed quickly. In that design, it is already a behavioral instrument. A notification is not only information. Fourth term, governance. Governance here does not mean laws or formal authority. It means the practical shaping of behavior through rules, defaults, friction, incentives, and feedback. A hallway sign that channels foot traffic is governance. A cue that forces turn-taking is governance. A notification system that chooses what is urgent, what is highlighted, and what is repeated is also governance. With these terms, we can restate the core question in a more operational form. When a system repeatedly claims attention through interruptions, how does that repeated context switching alter the person's habits of noticing and deciding? And how do those habits accumulate into identity? A plain example. Imagine reading a page, being interrupted, returning to the page, and repeating that cycle many times. Even if each interruption is brief, the reading changes. The reader learns to skim. The reader learns to anticipate the next interruption. The reader may begin to treat the page itself as a temporary holding area rather than a place to dwell. Nothing dramatic occurs in any single moment, but a new normal is trained. Now expand the example. Not one page, but a day. Not one day, but a year. At that point, we are no longer discussing a momentary cost. We are discussing a pattern of cognition. Assumptions. Stated explicitly. 1. Repetition trains. Human attention adapts to the environment it repeatedly encounters. The mind becomes efficient at the tasks it is asked to perform often. 2. Defaults matter. Many interactions happen without deliberate choice. We do not decide each time whether to be interruptible. We live inside preset pathways of alerting, previewing, and responding. 3. Incentives shape design. Notification systems are rarely neutral. They are tuned implicitly or explicitly to increase engagement, compliance, responsiveness, safety, or other goals. Even when designers intend good outcomes, optimization tends to privilege what is measurable. 4. Time horizon changes the evaluation. In the short term, a notification can be helpful and rational. Over a longer horizon, the same pattern can produce side effects that were not part of the original intention. A 3-horizon framing will keep us honest. Short horizon, minutes to days, interruptions affect what you do next. Speed, focus, error rate, mood, and immediate decisions. Mid-horizon, weeks to months, interruptions shape habits, how you start tasks, how you tolerate silence, how quickly you seek feedback, how you triage priorities. Long horizon, years, interruptions shape identity and judgment, what you trust, what you value, what you consider normal, how you perceive your own agency, and how you form durable beliefs. Model limits must also be named. We cannot measure identity with a clean instrument, and we cannot cleanly separate cause from correlation in complex lives. Some thrive amid rapid switching, others do not. Context matters. Caregiving, safety-critical work, collaboration, and learning environments all change what good interruption means. And we must also admit that some benefits of notifications, coordination, accessibility, timely warning, are real. Any model that treats notifications as only harmful is incomplete. So our goal is not a final verdict. Our goal is to see the system more clearly. What it permits, what it constrains, and what it ignores. The central tension is not technology good versus technology bad. The tension is a set of trade-offs that become unstable when scaled. Consider the paradox of speed versus safety. Notifications often exist to speed coordination, faster replies, faster updates, faster resolution. Speed can be protective, yet speed also reduces reflection. When the system rewards immediate response, it can penalize careful thought. Over time, people may learn that judgment is less about accuracy and more about responsiveness. A fast response becomes a proxy for competence, even when it is not. Now consider capability versus control. Modern systems make it possible to reach anyone nearly any time. This capability can be used for care, coordination, and emergency. But control over when and how contact happens is unevenly distributed. The sender can cast a wide net at low cost. The receiver pays the cognitive cost of evaluation. The asymmetry matters. When a claim on attention is cheap to generate and costly to ignore, the system tends to produce more claims than the receiver can honor with integrity. Now consider local gain versus global stability. At a local level, each notification can be rational. A reminder prevents forgetting. An update keeps a team aligned. A message maintains connection. But at the global level, a constant stream of alerts creates a baseline state of partial attention. The system may become stable at the platform level, while unstable at the human level. The individual becomes the shock absorber for the system's volume. This is where governance enters with quiet force. Notification systems operate through incentives and constraints. They elevate certain events as urgent. They offer social rewards for quick replies. They penalize delay through anxiety, missed opportunities, or social friction. They create an ambient expectation of availability. They hide their own logic. Why this alert? Why now? Why this format? Incentive-driven drift over time is a key pattern. A system begins with a narrow purpose: alert the user to important events. Then metrics arrive: open rates, response times, engagement, retention, compliance. Optimization follows the measurable. Alerts become more frequent, more personalized, more emotionally salient. The system does not need malice. It only needs an objective function that is easier to quantify than human flourishing. 2 failure modes help make this concrete. One local, one systemic. Local failure mode, attention fragmentation. When interruptions are frequent, the mind becomes trained for switching rather than staying. This can manifest as difficulty entering deep work, impatience with slow tasks, and a felt need to check for updates even when none exist. The judgment cost appears in small errors, misreading, forgetting the original plan, making decisions without reconstructing context. The identity cost appears as a subtle shift. I am someone who is always catching up. The self becomes a custodian of an inbox, rather than an author of a day. Systemic failure mode, priority inversion at scale. In complex systems, the most important signals are not always the most frequent or the most emotionally stimulating. Yet notification systems tend to privilege what is immediate, what is interactive, what triggers a response. Over time, the environment becomes filled with high salience, low importance signals. Meanwhile, slow signals, long-term projects, quiet relationships, health of institutions, deep learning, receive less reinforcement because they do not generate frequent pings. The system thereby inverts priorities. The urgent becomes important because it is urgent. Notice that neither failure mode requires anyone to intend harm. They arise from mismatch, a human nervous system shaped for limited, meaningful cues, placed inside an environment where cues are abundant, engineered, and competitive. A second systemic tension deserves attention: measurement versus meaning. Notification systems are often optimized around what can be counted: clicks, opens, replies, time to response. Judgment, however, is often about what cannot be counted: whether the right question was asked, whether silence was appropriate, whether a delay allowed better synthesis. Identity is even less countable: whether a person experiences themselves as coherent, capable of sustained thought, and able to set priorities that endure. Optimization has a well-known tendency. It becomes the map that replaces the territory. When an organization, a product, or a social norm starts to treat response time as virtue, then slowness becomes suspect. But slowness is sometimes the price of care. The tension cannot be eliminated, it must be governed. A third tension: personalization versus common reality. Notifications can be tailored to what each person tends to respond to. This can reduce noise, but it can also create a loop. The system learns what captures you, then captures you more. The person's attention becomes increasingly shaped by past attention. In the short run, it feels efficient. In the long run, it can narrow the range of what is noticed. Judgment then becomes path-dependent. Identity becomes, in part, a reflection of what the system has learned to present. Here, uncertainty matters. We cannot easily disentangle whether people become more distractible because of notifications, or whether notifications increase because people already prefer fast feedback. Both can be true. They can amplify each other. The relevant point for governance is not perfect causal attribution. The relevant point is that feedback loops exist, and feedback loops can be stabilized or destabilized by design choices. Another limit: not all interruptions are the same. Some are safety critical. Some are relationally meaningful. Some are administrative. Some are opportunistic. The system often flattens these distinctions into a uniform delivery mechanism, which forces the receiver to do the classification work. The mind becomes a sorting machine. Sorting is not the same as thinking. At this point, we can name the paradox in one line: the tools designed to increase responsiveness can, at scale, decrease discernment. And because this happens gradually, it tends to be interpreted as a personal failing rather than an environmental property. The person blames themselves for not focusing. The system remains unexamined. Yet governance is part of the system. The question is not whether there will be constraints. The question is whether the constraints are chosen, visible, and aligned with the kind of judgment we claim to value. Consequences are best described across horizons, because the same mechanism produces different effects depending on the timescale. Short horizon consequences, minutes to days. 1. Context loss and error. Each interruption carries a switching cost. Not only the time spent reading the alert, but the time spent reconstructing what you were doing. The immediate consequence is small mistakes, missing details, duplicating work, forgetting a subtle constraint. These are not moral failures, they are predictable cognitive costs. 2. Triage becomes the default mode. When alerts arrive continually, the mind shifts into queue management. Decisions become dominated by what is next and what is loudest. This can be functional in crisis response, but as a baseline state, it changes what counts as thinking. Judgment becomes reactive. 3. Emotional coloring of the day. Notifications often carry social or evaluative content: approval, demands, comparisons, updates that hint at scarcity or urgency. Even when each is mild, the cumulative effect can be a background sense of being assessed. This does not automatically harm everyone, but it does tilt attention toward external validation as a frequent reference point. Mid-horizon consequences, weeks to months. 1. Habit formation around immediacy. Repeated cues train repeated responses. The device becomes a teacher. When you feel uncertainty, check. When you have a gap, fill it. When you are bored, refresh. Over time, the person may lose comfort with unstructured moments where synthesis happens. This is a trade-off. You gain rapid information, but you may reduce the space where insights consolidate. 2. Narrowing of what is rewarded. If quick replies receive immediate social reinforcement, then deliberation receives less. People learn to be present in the channel that measures presence. The mid-horizon consequence is a subtle reshaping of competence. Competence becomes legible responsiveness rather than quiet depth. This creates selection pressure. Roles and reputations may drift toward those who can sustain constant availability, even when that is not the same as producing high-quality judgment. Attention becomes externally timed. When most transitions are triggered externally, the person's internal sense of timing weakens. This can manifest as difficulty initiating tasks without an external cue, or difficulty staying with a task when no immediate feedback arrives. The self becomes in part a function of external scheduling. Long horizon consequences, years. 1. Identity as a set of reflexes. Identity is often spoken of as values and beliefs, but it is also made of practiced reflexes, what you reach for under stress, what you do when uncertain, what you treat as real work, what you treat as waiting. A life shaped by constant interruption can produce an identity that is fluent in responsiveness and less fluent in contemplation. Not worse in a moral sense, simply different, with different strengths and vulnerabilities. 2. Judgment under compression. Judgment involves holding multiple considerations at once, weighing trade-offs, and resisting premature closure. Frequent interruption compresses the time available for holding complexity. Over years, this can produce a preference for simpler narratives and faster conclusions, because the environment continually pulls toward resolution. The risk is not that people become incapable of thought, but that the ecology of thought becomes less hospitable to slow reasoning. 3. The normalization of surveillance-like self-monitoring. When notifications are tied to performance, responsiveness, or social standing, people may internalize a monitoring stance. What am I missing? How do I look? Have I responded fast enough? Over long horizons, this can become part of character, a persistent posture of anticipatory checking. The cost is not only time, it is the erosion of a self that can be alone with its own priorities. 4. Collective epistemic drift. At scale, when many people live inside interruption-heavy environments, the collective patterns of sense-making shift. What spreads is what triggers a rapid response. What persists is what stays in the feed. Slow correction, careful qualification, and patient ambiguity struggle to compete with immediacy. This is not a claim that truth disappears. It is a claim that the conditions under which truth is socially stabilized can be weakened when attention is continuously redistributed. Trade-offs must be kept in view, or the analysis becomes propaganda. Coordination improves. Teams and families can adapt quickly. Emergencies can be responded to. Accessibility can improve. Timely prompts can reduce barriers and prevent forgotten tasks. Social connection can be maintained across distance. These are real benefits. The question is the price, and who pays it. Second-order effects clarify the price. A first-order effect, a notification delivers information. A second-order effect, the presence of frequent notifications changes what kinds of information get produced and valued. People craft messages to trigger responses. Organizations structure work so that visible interruptive tasks win over silent, slow tasks. Attention becomes a scarce resource traded in a market of salience. Persistence is another property to name. Once norms of constant availability form, they can become hard to reverse, not because of coercion, but because of coordination. If everyone expects rapid response, then any one person's slowness feels like a defect. The system locks in. This is a governance problem. A tail risk deserves mention without dramatization. If a society's decision-making is widely trained towards short-horizon responsiveness, then long-horizon problems, those requiring sustained attention and patience, may receive chronic underinvestment. This is not inevitable, and it is hard to quantify, but it is plausible enough to treat as a resilience concern. The more a system relies on rapid cycles of alert and response, the more brittle it can become when confronted with problems that do not yield to rapid cycles. Uncertainty remains. Individuals and communities vary. Some can integrate interruptions without losing coherence. Some roles require constant alertness. Some periods of life legitimately demand high interruptibility. The goal is not to erase interruptions, but to understand them as forces that accumulate. If we take the long horizon seriously, then the central consequence is this: interruptions do not only steal time, they shape what kind of time feels normal, and therefore what kind of life feels possible. There is a temptation, whenever we speak of attention, to turn immediately toward prescription. Do this, ban that, adopt a regimen, enforce a rule. Prescription can be useful, but it can also function as avoidance, a way to escape the harder work of seeing. So let us remain with the question itself. How do interruptions reshape identity and judgment over time? They do so by repetition, by reward, and by reference. Repetition. What happens often becomes easy, and what becomes easy becomes default. Reward. What receives immediate reinforcement becomes attractive, even when it is not aligned with long-term aims. Reference. What you consult repeatedly becomes the frame through which you interpret everything else. This is not mystical. It is basic learning. Yet the learning is often hidden, because it is distributed across thousands of small moments. A disciplined humility is required here, because we are dealing with two complex systems interacting: the human mind and the social-technical environment. Both adapt. Both change when observed, and both contain multiple goals that do not reduce to a single metric. If notifications are governance, then an important question is, what is being governed toward? In some contexts, the answer is legitimate: safety, coordination, care. In other contexts, the answer is ambiguous: engagement, responsiveness, measurable activity. Often the answer is plural and inconsistent. A system may say only what matters, while its incentives say what can be measured. That inconsistency is not a personal failing, it is a structural tension. When governance is invisible, it is easy to internalize its outputs as personal identity. I am distractible. I cannot focus. I am behind. Those statements may be partially true, but they may also be symptoms of an environment trained to pull. Yet we must also avoid the opposite error: blaming the environment for everything. People are not passive. Many interruptions are chosen. Some are sought. Some are a way of managing uncertainty, checking to reduce the discomfort of not knowing. The system and the self co-produce the pattern. This is why neat answers do not fit. A single lever will not solve a multi-level feedback loop. What can be named without resolving is a kind of ethical design question, not ethics as moral absolutes, but ethics as alignment between mechanisms and meaning. If a system can summon attention instantly, should it do so by default? If urgency can be manufactured, how do we distinguish real urgency from engineered urgency? If responsiveness is rewarded, how do we preserve the legitimacy of silence? If constant updates are possible, what is lost when the mind no longer waits? None of these questions yields a universal answer. Their answers depend on role, context, and time horizon. But the questions themselves are a practice of reflection. They slow the system down long enough for governance to become visible. There is also a quiet grief that sometimes appears when people notice what has changed: the loss of uninterrupted thought, the loss of boredom, the loss of sustained reading, the loss of slow conversation. That grief can become sentimental, and sentimentality is not a strategy. But grief can also be informational. It can indicate misalignment between what the system trains and what the person values. Still, we must keep uncertainty at the center. Some changes are adaptation, not harm. Some forms of rapid distributed attention are genuinely powerful. The goal is not to return to an earlier pattern by force of will. The goal is to cultivate robustness, the capacity to function well across conditions, including interruption-heavy ones. Robustness here is not heroic self-control. It is the design of constraints, technical, social, and personal, that make good judgment easier and bad incentives harder to amplify. But naming that is not the same as issuing commands. So we end this section without resolution. We simply acknowledge every interruption is a small negotiation over who sets the agenda of the moment. And over time, those negotiations accumulate into a life. To see that clearly is already a form of governance, because what is seen can be discussed, and what is discussed can be shaped. But the shape is not guaranteed and the path is not singular. Uncertainty is not permission for neglect. It is a reason to watch the feedback loops with care, and to keep the long horizon in view.